The sun was a molten disk above the Alabama plains, baking the earth in an unforgiving heat. The air shimmered like liquid glass, warping the edges of the world. I remember that day too well. It was the kind of day that burned itself into memory, not just for its heat, but for what it stole from us. Orion Williamson was a man of habit, a farmer, a father, a husband. He lived a simple life, and that afternoon was no different. Until it was. I stood on my porch, wiping the sweat from my brow, watching Orion step out from his front door. His wife and son stood nearby, waving him off as he crossed the open field behind their home. He carried nothing but a tin cup of water, moving with an easy, unhurried pace toward his livestock. His neighbors, the Mathers, sat on their porch just across the way, idly rocking in their chairs, witnessing the same thing I did. Then, Orion vanished. There was no warning, no cry, no stumble. One moment he was there. The next, gone. His tin cup clattered to the earth, spilling water onto the dry grass. That was the only sound. No wind, no birds, just silence. A scream split the air. His wife. She ran forward, hands outstretched as if she could pluck him from the void. The Mathers were on their feet, their chairs rocking violently behind them. I didn't realize I had moved until I felt the sting of grass whipping against my shins as I sprinted forward. The place where he had disappeared was nothing special, just dry, cracked earth, sun-bleached grass, and the scent of summer heat. We circled it, searched for holes, for any sign that the ground had given way. But there was nothing, nothing at all. Within an hour, half the town had gathered. Men with shovels, women wringing their hands, children clinging to their mothers, whispering in hushed voices. We dug into the ground where he had last stood, expecting something. A hole, a hidden pit, a trick of the eye. But there was nothing to explain it. By nightfall, the search party had spread across the entire field. We burned torches, lit lanterns, called his name into the darkness. The only answer was the chirping of crickets and the distant howl of a wolf. But then, just as I turned to leave, I heard something. So faint I almost doubted myself. A whisper, not from around me, not from behind me, not from above, from beneath. A dry, rasping voice. Weak. Help me. And then, silence. The night swallowed the sound, leaving nothing but the wind through the grass. The sound froze me where I stood. A voice, his voice, whispering up from the ground, barely more than a breath against my ear. It had been so faint, I almost convinced myself I imagined it. Almost. I turned back to the field, my heart pounding against my ribs. The others had already started drifting home, their faces pale with something between fear and exhaustion. Only Orion's wife remained, kneeling in the dirt where her husband had last stood, her hands pressed against the earth. Her lips moved, whispering his name over and over, like a prayer or a plea. I stepped closer. Did you hear that? My voice was a dry rasp, barely louder than the insects humming in the grass. She didn't look up, only pressed her ear to the ground. A moment passed, stretched thin by the weight of silence. Then her eyes went wide. Her breath hitched in her throat, a sharp, trembling inhale, and she scrambled backward on her hands and knees, clawing at the dirt as if it had bitten her. "He's there," she gasped. "He's under..." She couldn't finish. Her body trembled, her fingers digging into the earth, nails breaking against the brittle grass. She was listening. I dropped to my knees beside her and pressed my ear to the ground. The dirt was warm against my skin, and for a moment all I could hear was the pulse of blood in my ears. Then it came again. "Help me." My breath hitched. The voice was unmistakable. Orion. But it wasn't right. It wasn't just below me. It was deep, too deep, as if he'd fallen miles beneath the surface, lost in an impossible chasm. I lurched back, my stomach twisting into knots. This wasn't a sinkhole. This wasn't a cave. The ground hadn't opened up and swallowed him. He had simply vanished. And yet, he was still there, buried in nothing. The Mathers had stayed behind, and when they saw our faces, they knew. We weren't crazy. We weren't imagining things. We heard him. The next day, we dug. Not just me, but the whole town. We ripped apart the field with shovels, hands, anything we could find. The deeper we dug, the louder the voice became. He called for us, begged us, his words slurred with exhaustion and fear. But we found nothing. No tunnel, no hidden cavern, no coffin of dirt where he could have been trapped. And yet Orion's voice remained, trapped in the air like a ghostly echo, always below, always calling. By the third day, the voice changed. It wasn't pleading anymore. It was screaming, a sound so raw, so filled with terror and agony that some of the men dropped their shovels and refused to return. And then it stopped, cut off mid-wail, as if someone or something had finally found him first. The silence was worse than the screams. For 3 days, we had listened to Orion's voice grow weaker, more frantic. We had dug until our hands bled, our fingers raw and caked with dirt, but the ground refused to give him back. And then, just like that, he was gone. Not a whisper, not a moan, not even the sound of breath struggling through unseen layers of earth. Nothing. The town fell into an uneasy quiet. No one spoke of it openly, but the fear clung to us like a sickness. People stopped coming to the field, stopped speaking Orion's name. His wife became a ghost of herself, staring out over the torn earth as if expecting him to reappear. But he never did, and that should have been the end of it. It wasn't. On the 5th night after Orion's disappearance, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside my window. Soft, uneven, shuffling. I sat up, my breath caught in my throat. The night was thick with the smell of damp earth, the kind that lingers after a heavy rain. But there hadn't been any storms. I swung my legs over the bed and crept to the window, peeling back the curtain just enough to see. The moonlight stretched long over the fields, painting the land in sickly shades of gray. My stomach twisted. Something stood in the field. Not someone. Something. It was tall, thin, its limbs too long, its posture unnatural. Its head twitched in erratic motions as if trying to listen for something just out of reach. The thing was covered in dirt, clumps of soil clinging to its body in wet, jagged patches. My breath caught in my throat. My pulse pounded in my ears. Then it moved, not with steps, but jerks, like it was being pulled forward by invisible strings. Its head snapped toward my house. I stumbled back from the window, my heart hammering. No, it wasn't looking at the house. It was looking at me. I locked the doors, barricaded the windows, sat in the dark with my breath shallow, waiting for something to happen. Minutes passed, then hours. And just when the silence became unbearable, I heard it, a whisper. "Help me!" But it wasn't coming from outside. It was behind me. I turned slowly, my skin crawling, my body frozen. And that's when I saw it. The floorboards beneath my feet, they were moving. The wood bulged, pressing upward, as if something was trying to claw its way out. The floor groaned beneath me, a slow, sickly creak that made my stomach churn. My breath hitched as I watched the wooden planks pulse, rising and falling like something underneath was breathing. I wanted to move. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. Not when I heard that voice again. "Help me!" Orion's voice. But it wasn't right. It wasn't a plea anymore. It wasn't desperate or weak. It was wrong. I took a shaky step back, my bare feet nearly slipping on the wooden boards. The house was deathly silent, save for the slow, deliberate shifting of the floor beneath me. Then, crack! A jagged split tore through the wood, splintering like something was forcing its way out. I stumbled backward, barely catching myself before my knees hit the ground. My lungs squeezed tight, my pulse roaring in my ears. And then, a hand pushed through. No, not a hand. Not anymore. It was pale, bloated, the skin stretched thin like old parchment. Long, jagged fingernails curled against the broken wood, blackened with dirt. The fingers twitched, spasmed, and then dug into the floorboards as something else pulled itself up from the darkness beneath my home. The smell hit me first. Rot, damp earth, something ancient and wrong. I wanted to scream, but my voice was lodged deep in my throat, trapped there like a stone. The thing kept rising. A face pushed through the broken boards and my stomach lurched violently. It was Orion, or at least it had been. His skin was waxy, sagging. His eyes, oh God, his eyes were hollow black pits, wet with something that gleamed in the dim light. His mouth hung open, an unnatural grin stretching too wide, his lips cracked and peeling. But the worst part, he was still whispering, "Help me, help me, help me." Over and over, the words slipping from his lips like a broken record. But the more he said it, the more the voice changed. It deepened, twisted, until it wasn't Orion's voice at all. It was something else, something ancient, something that had never been human. The air in the room became heavy, pressing down on me like I was being smothered. My vision swam. My body screamed at me to run, to move, to do something. But then, the whispering stopped. Silence. Orion's twisted mouth snapped shut. His hollow eyes locked onto mine. And then, slowly, deliberately, he grinned, a sharp, unnatural movement that sent ice-cold terror straight through my veins. Then, the whispering started again, but this time it was coming from all around me. Not just from the thing that had once been Orion, from the walls, from the ceiling, from beneath the floor. "Help me, help me, help me!" I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't stop. The voices only grew, layering over each other, growing louder, more desperate, more hungry. And then, something grabbed my ankle. I looked down. Orion's arms were stretching, lengthening unnaturally, wrapping around my leg, pulling me toward the gaping hole in the floor. And I couldn't stop it. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me was Orion's grinning face watching me fall. I braced for the fall, expecting cold, crushing emptiness to swallow me whole. But instead, I landed hard on solid ground. I gasped, my lungs filling with warm, fresh air. My body ached, my head spun, but I was alive. I opened my eyes and blinked against the blinding sunlight. I was in the field, not beneath it, not trapped in the endless void. Just the field. The sky stretched wide above me, blue and endless, as if nothing had ever happened. The dirt was dry beneath my fingers, the wind soft against my face. And then, a voice. "You're back." I turned, my breath catching in my throat. Orion. He stood there, whole, alive. His skin was no longer pale and stretched, his eyes no longer hollow black pits. He looked like himself, like the man I had known before he vanished, and he was smiling. "I thought I was lost forever," he said, his voice shaking. "I thought we both were." I scrambled to my feet, my mind racing. "How?" "Something let us go," Orion said, looking around in wonder. I don't know why, but it did. I turned, expecting to see the town in ruins, expecting to hear the whispers crawling back from beneath the earth. But there was nothing. No horrors, no voices, no signs of the nightmare we had endured. Just an empty field beneath a perfect sky. And then, the door to Orion's farmhouse swung open. His wife, his child. They ran to him, their cries filling the air. Orion caught them in his arms, his shoulders shaking as he buried his face in his wife's hair. I stepped back, my hands still trembling. Was it really over? I turned toward the town in the distance, waiting for something, anything to tell me this wasn't real, that this was another trick, another illusion pulling me deeper. But the wind was warm, the birds were singing, and for the first time in a long, long time, the earth was quiet. I didn't know why we had been spared. I didn't know what had released us or if it had simply chosen to wait. But I did know one thing. We had been given a second chance, and I would never set foot in that field again.